Good morning, good morning. It's great to be with you. And we're looking forward to these next 2 days as well as the World Bank Urbanization Conference. I am Justin Visagie. I am an associate professor at the University of Free State. Also work at the Human Sciences Research Council. And I have a passion for cities and for urban development. And so it's a pleasure to teach this session. Before I start, I wasn't here for any of the other lectures. Do we have a sense of who's in the room? If you consider yourself an economist, can you put your hand up? Just kind of, okay. You did. If you consider yourself maybe an urban planner or in that kind of field, put your hand up. Okay. And if you don't know who you are, can you put your hand up? Okay. Interesting. Okay, so it's obviously a bit of a challenging session to sort of navigate with all these different interests in the room. But I think also what's really interesting to me about working in this field is that understanding geography, understanding cities intersects with many disciplines and we can learn from each other. So I'm to talk to you about firms and we need to finish at what time, Visagie? 1:15 for lunch. So we'll kind of, I'll see what I might skip through more quickly or not. But I think given that this is the third session, we definitely need to do some talking amongst ourselves. Maybe the place to start with an interesting example. I don't know if my YouTube clip is going to be able to play. Shall we give it a bash? Okay, I'll try again. Oh, yeah, that sounds good. Let's try that. Yeah, maybe that one.
Completed what others have called a miracle within 4 decades. It's no argument that Shenzhen has become a shining star on the world stage, not just because of its skyscrapers and energetic people, but more a consequence of its sense of future. It all started 40 years ago, when the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone was established as an important step in China's drive toward a market economy that was led by Deng Xiaoping. Before 1980, the fishing village was a channel for people leaving the Chinese mainland to Hong Kong. More than 600,000 people were estimated to have crossed the bay in search of better economic opportunities. Shenzhen remains a bridge between the mainland and the autonomous region, but the traffic is now heading in the other direction. The city's economy is over 10,000 times bigger since it was born, and the population has grown from 300,000 to over 13 million. China's biggest tech firms, Tencent, Huawei, and DJI, are all Shenzheners. As leaders in their fields, these giants have shaped the city's economy and attracted talent from all over the world. The story of Shenzhen is moving on, just like the people there continuing to dare to dream big.
So Shenzhen's quite a remarkable story of a fairly new city that's emerged in the 1980s, and you can see from those visuals something quite striking, right? A huge urban metropolis, 1985, nothing really much there. Fast forward to today, and a bustling city. If you just look at some stats in terms of the total FDI going into the region, you'll see that it goes from 0 through to in the billions, and we can see the same for exporting. So as we start thinking about firms and the role of cities and firms, I want you to turn to kind of the person on either side of you, just for 5 minutes, and I want you to have a think about this question, which is, what conditions, both planned and unplanned, enabled Shenzhen to evolve from a fishing village into a global hub for manufacturing and exports in just 4 decades? What conditions, what factors, unplanned and planned, do you think enabled this transformation? And then I'm going to pick on you at random, so...
My name is Ashanti. I think another thing that helped them were the tech firms that moved into that area, like
Okay.
Huawei and those huge tech firms attracted a lot of employment into the, yeah.
Cool. Okay, well, let's start with a few thoughts. Often in economics, we think about what are first order or natural advantages of a place. And that's not got to do with anything man-made. It's more just spontaneous or unplanned. And in Shenzhen's case, actually, it's very well located next to Hong Kong. In fact, if it wasn't so close to that big urban center, which enabled firms in the nearby proximity to sort of invest next door, you wonder whether the same miracle could have happened. Again, SEZs, there's a debate about how you get SEZs going. Do you sort of put them in lagging or leading regions? But proximity, and a city's proximity to elsewhere and a firm's proximity to others really matters. So that's one thought. The other is its proximity specifically to Hong Kong, right? And Hong Kong, as a sort of, in China, I think they call it two systems, one country. Again, big, important economic node, China mainland wanting to sort of copy and emulate that. The other unplanned factor is proximity to the coast, right? If you look at cities, one thing that they mostly have in common is that actually their ability to trade, whether through a big river that connects to a coast, etc., is generally a big advantage. So that would be what we'd call spontaneous or natural things. But it wasn't just spontaneous and natural, right? There was a lot else happening. Big factor was China changing its trade policy and becoming more outward focused, and they were experimenting, and they created these special economic zones. They gave it a special status, and that policy change enabled and encouraged the investment to take place. So that's sort of a second order kind of feature. But to go along with that, the government needed to spend a lot of money, right? In the built environment, you can't just have a fishing village become what it was. There's a whole lot of man-made investment that needs to take place and often has to lead the way. Often we have this sort of chicken and egg problem that cities face. They want to argue for the infrastructure, but do they have the demand for the infrastructure? But you can't get the demand unless you do the investment. And these are sort of the challenges of local policy. China has the advantage of being a government that owns all the land. So the type of investment and the kind of development they can make has often been a lot more straightforward in terms of wielding that muscle. But certainly quite a miraculous transformation that took place. I think the other big factor that happened in China is that they relaxed some of their migrant labor system. I think it's Hoko or Huku, I don't know how you pronounce it. And essentially that also enabled a lot of cheap labor to be moving and supplying that particular region. Globally, at the same time, America starting to outsource and offshore, all of these things coming together and enabling to take place. Okay. And I start with this example because, the reality of a city and the reality of firms concentrating in a place like that, which is clearly so transformative, is something very obvious, but we don't always appreciate it. This is obviously a sort of caricature of who? Isaac Newton, right? And he was sitting down, and the story goes, he saw the apple fall from the tree and thought, no, hang on a second, why is the apple falling from the tree? And I sort of feel in economics that economists need to have the same epiphany, is that we see it every day. We see the reality of cities and firms, of agglomeration, which we're really going to talk about today, but sometimes we just haven't really appreciated it. So, if you look at any country in the world, here are some maps of a population density, and you can sort of see the spikes. Is there a pointer? Let me try and push. There we go. You can sort of see the spikes with the big cities where population density increases. Whether you look at Argentina, this is England, I think there's London over there. You can look at Turkey. So developing or developed countries, you can see that they all have this in common. This is Spain, and Pakistan. And that is, the economy doesn't spread itself out evenly. I always like to say, like, you like your butter on your toast nice and even. But firms don't operate that way. They like to concentrate. And really today's lecture is about thinking about why. Why does this take place? Why is it so important? Because it is a fundamental reality of our everyday life. So, maybe just a quick throw to South Africa, where we are here today. What does South Africa look like? This is using some new spatial tax data where we can sort of map formal employment across different municipalities. There's a paper we have just sort of outlining some of the basic geography that you can have a look at if you're in South Africa and interested in thinking about the role of geography. And you can clearly see that employment concentrates in the metros. There, that's the Johannesburg, Gauteng city region, Joburg there, Ekurhuleni and Tshwane. There's eThekwini, where I'm from. You've got your other nodes, and Cape Town, where we're based today. But what's quite nice is actually to sort of turn this figure on its head and actually change what it looks like so that the concentration of employment now is the size of the visual that you see, right? And actually that's more accurate to what our country looks like in terms of its economic development. It's tiny cities geographically, but actually in terms of their weight of the economy, far, far, far more significant. So when we think about economic development, when we think about the labor market, when we think about firms, are we thinking through these reality? In fact, I think it's just 5 metros in South Africa account for 60% of all formal jobs, just in 5 metros. And recall, we've got over 200 local municipalities in South Africa, so just in 5 places. Now, clearly, if you're a government and you're needing to move your country forward, that creates challenges in terms of spatial inequality and equity, but it also creates opportunities, because that's where it all is, right? And if you can get it right in those places, clearly, nationally, it's going to have serious outcomes. The same is sort of looking at our fiscal resources. This is what SARS report. You can sort of see the way in which they sort of say most of the tax base coming from Gauteng as you go on. And if you even weight it by person, so it's not just the fact that you concentrate in terms of population, but even on a per person terms, you still sort of see this ranking in terms of municipalities. This is the sort of new figure I've been playing with. Here we classify our municipalities in these groups: metro, secondary city, large towns, small towns, and mostly rural. And this x-axis over here is a population to employment ratio, employment to population. So this is saying that, let's start with the metros. On average, sort of in the middle, you've got about 23 working persons for every 100 people in your population. So you can see that actually a much healthier employment to population ratio in the metros, even though they still have to cope with all the in-migration, et cetera, et cetera. And then as you move down the settlement hierarchy, you can see how it deteriorates. And really, this is a huge challenge in South Africa. Look at mostly rural municipalities. You've only got 5 formal jobs for every 100 persons. And that shows you the sort of legacy of underdevelopment, that these places have a very low economic base. So this is the reality of spatial dynamics and firms and sorting that we see in countries. Oh, wait, I can use that. Okay, so thinking more carefully and closely about this, what we're seeing is these issues of urban advantage. And the word in economics is agglomeration. That's the word. And agglomeration economies, in short. So if you've done Economics 101, you would have heard about what this phrase of internal economies of scale. And that's the idea that if you have a firm that doubles its output, that its costs can fall. All right? And there can be any number of reasons for it. You can think of markets where you have a very big fixed cost, right? So if you invest in this big fixed cost, then the more you sell, you're able to then lower your costs. And that causes a natural monopoly in that case. And so the sort of bigger this firm gets, the more productive it is, the lower its costs are. Internal economies of scale. But when it comes to firms and cities, the big idea is that actually you're getting these external economies of scale. So there's a positive advantage for firms within this geographically located area. At the end of the day, firms often have to pay a premium for being somewhere. Why do they pay that premium? Because it's worth their while, right? They're prepared to pay for the higher costs that are often associated with trying to access land in particular places because of advantages. And that is a sort of fundamental sort of reality of it. So in terms of different ways in which this advantage works itself out, we sometimes think about measuring it in terms of what they call localization economies. And this is essentially within a particular industry. So firms operating in the same value chain, or I think the word is sort of horizontal economies within the same cluster. So the idea is you concentrate in a particular sector, and the more that you have concentrated together, everybody benefits, right? So you getting an advantage as a firm by co-locating close to somebody else. The other way of thinking about it is yes, it is still a concentration, but it's a between industry concentration, what's known as urbanization economies. So it's the diversity that you get. So it doesn't matter that I'm a finance firm and you're a construction firm, but the fact that we're in these different sectors means that we can somehow learn from each other and innovate and in the same way get advantages. So both of these terms are about concentration or agglomeration, but the one specific to your sector or your industry, where the other is more focusing on the overall size and the diversity. Right. So interesting ideas, but this is probably the main issue. How does it work? Why does being located with your competitors and with others help you? What are the reasons for this? And can you think of any channels of advantage for firms? Right. So rather than breaking into groups, because I'm just trying to manage the time, can I get some ideas off the top of your head? How does this work? Clearly, firms get an advantage from being close and in proximity to one another, the connectivity, but why? Blank stares. Can I have a yes, a brave hand? Information sharing, okay. What kind of information do you think they share? Not sure. Good, yes?
Transport time and like distance to and then those savings.
Yeah, transport.
The supply chain essentially might be a lot more consolidated.
Yeah, if you can think about your suppliers, if they're close by to you, then you're saving on those transport costs. Also just the natural communication, I think that's one thing. Yes, over here. Customers, local markets. Where are the people you're trying to sell to? If you're far away from them, that can create problems for you. Good ideas. Yes.
I am Mudu from Visagie University, Ethiopia. With regard to the advantage, they get exchange of technology, and there is also input-output relationship. The output of one firm might be the input for the other, and the vice versa. Thank you.
In terms of the supply chain, thinking about that, but also learning from each other. Definitely. Clear. These are all good ideas. We have one more. Thank you.
Thank you. Makhanse Meregi from University of South Africa. The other one as well is infrastructure development. Because if
Yes.
you're a new firm and let's say you build something just like in Shenzhen, I know South Africa has a policy that as an entity, if you are there, especially in the mining sector, you will be tasked with building the roads and as well employing some of the people from the township. So if there are a lot of firms in an area, you get to benefit from each other through investments and infrastructure development, electricity as well, and so forth.
Right. Yeah. So you can share the costs of that investment in infrastructure. Great. This is what I wanted to hear. Let's think about your favorite football or soccer team, right? Do you think it's easy for a football team? I'm thinking about the South African example. Where are the most popular teams generally based? Who supports who here in the room? Huh? Yeah. Gauteng, yeah. So why do you think those teams, can tend to be the ones that are successful? I watch rugby, and you can think of the Sharks in Durban, and you can think of the Bulls in Pretoria. Wow. What about the Cheetahs? I'm also from University of Free State in Bloemfontein. Why can't they compete? So you think about these dynamics. It's the same for firms. It's the same sort of things that are going on for firms. And I think this deserves us to look around and think about the world and think about cities and why it all is. Okay, so what about just some general ideas? In fact, Adam Smith, who's considered the father of economics, he was thinking about these dynamics. And one of the things that he pointed out of being absolutely crucial is this area of specialization. So if you've got more firms in a particular area, then they tend to be able to specialize. And in specializing, you get a whole lot of advantages. His famous example of specialization is what is the pin factory. And he said that, if you've got someone who's trying to make pins and they're by themselves, they can maybe at max make 20 pins a day. But all of a sudden, these factories start popping up, and he looks around and he says, well, how do they work? Actually, they get together and one person focuses on one particular element of the pin job, and they specialize in that. And the next person, and then together when you add it up, you find that they're producing, 40,000 pins. And so this idea of specialization takes place with density, with agglomeration. So Adam Smith was already talking about it. The other person that you hear of in economics is Alfred Marshall, and this is maybe sort of most famously quoted. You might have heard people talking about this. He says, the mysteries of the trade become no mysteries, but as it were in the air, and children learn many of them unconsciously. And his big idea was actually when you're next to someone, even if it's your competitor, somehow you can pick up what's going on. There's a lot of learning that takes place and knowledge exchange. So it's not just about transport costs alone, even though that is a clearly important factor. It's not just about specialization, but it's also about the learning that can happen and the knowledge, which can be tacit. It's not always easy to codify. And in fact, what you often see in industries is that they innovate in big cities, which are expensive, etc. And then over time, they codify their knowledge, and then they sort of relocate to sort of lower cost advantages over time as they're able to sort of narrow and focus and specialize. Okay, so in the literature, it's Pucher and Duranton that they often talk about this classification of different agglomeration channels that they call sharing, matching, and learning. Okay, so 3 different ways in which firms can get an advantage by co-locating, right? So cities can facilitate sharing. So in consumption, the example of a sports arena, why can't you have this massive sports arena out in, I'm trying to think of a remote place, in the Western Cape. Clearly the big sports arena is going to be somewhere where there are a lot of people of, because of the sharing advantage of the cost. There's a big fixed cost and you can share it. That's in consumption, but it's also the same for production because of the transport infrastructure. If you're going to invest in a big harbor, right, you need enough people to be using the harbor to justify the investment. So those fixed costs get shared out, and cities facilitate that. You also get the gains from sort of bigger markets happening in terms of, I spoke about the Adam Smith example of specialization, and Marshall's ideas of sort of learning from each other. All of this is the idea that you should have actually share a public, an external environment, and that makes you more productive. Okay. What about matching? I think maybe Andrew could have touched on some of these ideas of how you facilitate better matching. But essentially, if you think about a firm in a remote area, it's trying to sort of fill particular posts and tasks, and you might find that the employees that it's got are needing to generalize quite a lot because you know, they might have different talents and abilities, but you've got to work with what you've got, and that sort of matching process is not so good. But if you've got a much bigger pool, then you can actually really find the sort of person who's most productive for the need that you have. And so everyone is better off. The person working for you is better off because they're using their skills in a more sort of efficient way, and you're better off because you've got the skills that you need. So that's this idea of matching. And bigger pools do this in a better way. It's also sort of reduced risks and also churn that takes place, right? Because you can sort of move from one place to another fairly easily. Whereas if you're in a small economy, you sort of get stuck. And that ability to churn can also stimulate the better matching and the productivity, right? So that's the second way. And then the last sort of channel is we talk about cities facilitating learning. And I think it does seem to be more mysterious, the way in which learning takes place. But I don't know about you, me doing a lecture with you here face to face is far better in quality than if I did it online. Now, why is that the case? The way in which we are wired as human beings and knowledge and learning requires some form of dynamic interaction. So whether it's through the coffee shops that the IT professionals are in with one another, and one guy's from Google and one guy's from Microsoft, and how that all works. But in reality, this idea of knowledge and sharing of knowledge is intimately linked with proximity. Okay, and so knowledge generation, often you find that the sort of startups and the incubators emerge in bigger cities and new firms. So you get the sort of new disruptive forces going. But also just in terms of diffusing of that knowledge, so you can copy one another. You know, why is it that firms like to all be in Silicon Valley, right next door to their competitors? It's quite something. But actually it's that ability to sort of copy, and actually people working for Amazon and Google are moving between each other, you know, over time. And then accumulation, and this is the sort of dynamic effect or sort of third order or third nature advantage, and that it tends to compound itself over time and lock itself into a virtuous cycle, so that those places that were the winners early on continue to reinforce their advantage. It's very difficult then to sort of, yes, you want to be a high-tech hub, but if you just don't have the skilled labor force or the firms that you need, etc., it's very difficult, even with a deep pocket, for government just to start something new in a place where it doesn't exist. So where those particular expertise and specializations are tend to sort of lock themselves in over time, and this sort of accumulation factor. Okay, so those talking about some of the sort of channels of agglomeration advantage. A very well sort of, I don't know, seminal might be the word, a report by the World Bank in 2009. It's called Reshaping Economic Geography. And there they have a chapter talking specifically about the advantages of agglomeration. And here, sort of, I won't go through all of it for time, but sort of again, whole different ways of us thinking of these different aspects of urban advantage. The one that I haven't really touched on is this idea that comes from Jane Jacobs, which is the diversity and the cross-pollination between industries. And I think it's sometimes useful for us to think about smaller cities that might specialize in a particular industry versus your biggest cities that clearly don't have the same sense of specialization, but actually it's their number of different activities and a whole range of sectors that actually gives them some kind of advantage. So I think that's sort of the lay of the land when it comes to thinking about agglomeration. Okay, so I've been talking so far a lot about these ideas, okay? Why, in theory, why do firms locate? What could be the sources of advantage? But what does the evidence say? And what about Africa? Do African firms benefit in the same way as firms in the United States do, or in the UK, or in these other wealthy markets? So to go through the empirical evidence is a tricky thing to do, because if you've studied any economics, trying to disentangle what's causal versus what's correlation is not easy. So these are some of the things to be aware of. The one is that you could get this reverse causality. So cities may appear more productive, not because size causes productivity, but because already productive firms and workers are attracted to grow in those cities, blurring the causal direction. So actually it's the wrong way around. They are big and therefore these firms are going there. Similar issue is one of selection. Only the most productive firms and workers can afford to enter or remain in large, expensive cities. And this again would skew the observed productivity upward towards that sample. Another thing that could be happening when we're trying to measure this empirical is an omitted variable bias. For instance, you could have different qualities of governance going on between a bigger city with better skills and a smaller place. Or maybe it's the education levels of the workforce. You can see in reality, trying for us to actually see why these bigger places tend to be more productive is not straightforward. And then there's measurement issues. How do we what do we mean by city and size? Do we mean a density in a particular neighborhood? Do we mean the scale of the whole overall city? How do you define the boundaries of where the city starts and where it ends? All of these become pretty complicated and they make a difference. And how do you measure productivity? What variables would you choose to say that one firm's more productive or not than another? Lots of different choices going on. And then compound that with data deficiencies, which I think is the main issue on this question of African cities. Often we just don't have the spatial, granular kinds of information that we need to ask and answer some of these questions. Okay, but having said all of those disclaimers, let me give you some sort of highlights for what interesting empirical work has been done. So this is showing you an example of Spain, and it's pretty similar there are many different studies of many different countries, but just to sort of give you a general feel. And you can see here's the city size on the x-axis, going from 50,000 through to 2 million. And here is the mean annual earnings, so the wages that people earn. And often in studies of agglomeration and firm productivity, it's easier to sort of get access to data on workers than it is on firms. So they say, well, let's measure that productivity by what people get paid. If they're getting paid more, it's a sign of them being more productive. And there is this very positive relationship, you would agree. Hey? You're in a bigger city, you get paid more. Surprise, surprise. You can see here, quite impressive, 21% workers in Madrid earn 21% more than those in Valencia, and 46% more than those in Santiago. All right, so pretty impressive. But what's also interesting and worth flagging in the literature is that, yes, there is a static advantage, a once-off advantage of a bigger place being more productive. But when we look at workers over time, actually it's accumulative. So if you think about this figure here, and just stick with me, and this is the same paper looking at Spain, and they're able to look at workers and their entire workplace histories to sort of understand these dynamic changes, dynamic advantages. And you can see that at this point of migration, a worker in Santiago, all of a sudden, boom, he gets a premium. He's moved to Madrid. It's a once-off premium. Now, if it was a static advantage, thereafter you would expect the line to be flat, like so. But the line isn't flat. In fact, the worker, for every additional year that he's working in the big city, continues to generate an advantage. And in fact, this dynamic aspect of the agglomeration, adds up to about, I can't remember exactly, maybe I'll say it here. I think it's about 50%. Yeah, about half of the city size earnings premium. So in other words, if I moved to Santiago, I was in Santiago, I moved to Madrid, I worked for a few years, and I moved back to Santiago, I would drop down, but I wouldn't drop down to here. I would drop down to over there, or over there somewhere. In other words, I carry with me the experience and the knowledge that I've gained as a worker from being in the big city. So it's important for us to think about both these static effect. Yes, you get a once-off advantage, but also over time it accumulates. That experience that you're getting in the bigger city is adding up over time, and that also really matters. Okay, so there is a lot of empirical studies trying to measure this empirical reality that firms want to be in cities and bigger cities. This is from 2019. 47 studies reviewed. But if you look through the list, UK, Italy, France, Canada, Europe, you struggle to find a developing country listed, right? And the mean elasticity of size and earnings or productivity is 0.047. The World Bank, in that famous report that I quoted earlier, sort of reiterate this evidence, which has been updated. They say doubling of city size increases productivity by between 4 and 8%, right? And 4 and 8% might not sound that much, but if you think about starting at a very small city and doubling it, and then doubling it again and doubling it again, it can actually be really add up to something quite significant. So that's sort of what's common for the literature on developed countries. What about developing countries? Is there the same reality in terms of what firms benefit from being in bigger places? This is 2023, so fairly recent. I think Grover is from World Bank. And you can see there is just a list of developing countries, and there's a list of some developed ones. And what you find in a lot of studies is that the elasticity, size elasticity of wages or productivity or whatever measure they pick is actually bigger. Surprise, surprise. In many developing countries. But when they do the formal evaluation, 76 studies, 34 countries, they actually find that it disappears. So overall, they say it's the same sort of effect, right? So both developed and developing countries, there's evidence of this, you moving into bigger cities and getting a productivity advantage. What's interesting is that they have only one African country in the study. And the study, when you look closely, is of agricultural productivity in Malawi, so it's not even that relevant. So even though they claimed to have a sample, really Africa is missing in this particular analysis, right? But the bottom line is that both developed and developing countries have this relationship between productivity and city size. So this is the question for a bit of discussion. I want you to turn to the person next to you for 5 minutes. If bigger is better, then why don't we end up with one big super city? If that's what I've just shown you, right? If I've said you get this productivity advantage, well then let's just put all firms in one place. We'll be better off. Okay, can you talk to yourselves and tell me why we don't get one super city? Thank you. 5 minutes and I will pick on you again. So, okay. 15 minutes to lunch, so let me not let it draw on too much. Any hands? Any ideas? Why don't we get one big super city? Any ideas? Yes, Christoph at the back.
So, marginal returns to scale, and maybe some of the costs involved with scale and transport.
It's a very good economics answer. Okay. Can we have a translation? Anyone else? What does that mean in reality? Yes, at the back there.
Yes, at some point, once you reach a certain size, you start to get other challenges.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, I'm sure it's been coming up, right? And that is that there's a dark side of agglomeration. I've just been speaking about firms and why they might want to co-locate. But clearly there's a pushback, right? Well, congestion. No one likes congestion. Contagion, right? You sort of spread diseases a lot more easily when you're all next to one another. Pollution that happens. In South Africa context, let's not lose sight of this big issue of segregation, social instability, right? So there's sort of a limit. Yes, as you get bigger, there might be advantages, but you need to manage these advantages. One way of thinking about it is in terms of connectivity, right? if you get bigger, are you still getting the connectivity with one another? Because if you're not actually connected in practice because of all these things pushing back, then clearly you might be in the same area, but you might be actually far away. The other aspect to sort of grapple with is, we talk about the advantages of density and more people and population, but if that density isn't of a particular quality, of a sort of economic density, right, and it's just population, you're getting crowding rather than actual sort of productivity. I think these are the fundamental challenges. So we can think about the pull and the push away from cities, the centripetal forces promoting concentration. We've already spoken about all of these sorts of things: market size effects, thick employment, the matching, knowledge spillovers, but also things that are pushing away. So immobile factors. Sometimes you need to be in a particular place because those things are there. The mining industry, for instance, it needs to be by the mine, or the oil, or the natural resources, and that causes sort of natural distribution. But it can also be in terms of maybe a particular labor force or an education that has a skill set that you need. You need to go there rather than there. And sometimes history has very interesting reasons for why places get started in the first place, but once they're there, they're there, and that causes these different developmental paths. And ultimately about land. I think we will be talking about housing at some stage, and transport, and these sort of basic elements, but in a city you've got a fixed amount of land. Yes, you can build upwards, but even building upwards has its limits. And so eventually it'll start to inflate prices, etc., and it'll catch up. Okay. And the pure external diseconomies, such as the congestion, etc. Okay, so it's not all good news. I think one thing to think about is the different sorts of advantage. Add some more nuance. So the economists are very good at sort of cutting down to the raw dynamic, but not so good at contextualizing and understanding that things can play themselves out in very different ways, right? So how can these things play out in different ways? Well, often you do get an urban system, right? Not just one big city, but many cities playing different roles. You find that larger cities tend to be more diversified and service orientated. They can innovate, invent. This is the sort of Jane Jacobs urbanization economies idea: knowledge, incubation, disruption, and then expel mature industries eventually when they can codify the knowledge and do it cheaper elsewhere. Whereas your smaller cities then can be more industrialized, specialized, and manufacture in a particular niche area. Makes sense. And you get this life cycle of invention in big cities and then relocating to scale up in smaller places. And of course, it's always changing. Things like telecommunications. We're now seeing much more fluidity. Does that end cities altogether? No. But yes, the ways in which these things start to work themselves out are changing over time. But I think it's important for us to think about your country and your context and be thinking about the urban cities system. What's the characteristic of different cities? Do they just compete with one another, or can they complement one another? All right? And in what ways, what roles do they need to play? So I'm from eThekwini, Durban. Clearly, it's got a port and logistics function connecting through to Johannesburg and the Gauteng city region. In fact, those two regions you would expect to be dependent on one another for their well-being, not just competing. Right. Okay, so different sorts of cities, different sorts of advantage. Right. So what about Africa? Sort of coming full circle. You sort of been talking about cities, in saying that the evidence is patchy. This is a fairly recent study, I think it was 2020 or somewhere around there, by Paul Collier and Patricia Jones. And they used World Bank data, World Enterprise surveys, and combined it with satellite imagery for a range of different cities. But they split out African cities from Asian and Latin American. And you can see here, this is they're measuring productivity in terms of output or revenue of firms, or they're measuring productivity in terms of what firms pay their workers, so two different ways. And what you'll notice is the stars are missing when it comes to Africa. In other words, they're not finding a statistically significant relationship between African cities and productivity. And the same goes whether you look at the measure of output or you look at the measure of wages. Whereas in other places like Asia and Latin America, they do find this positive relationship. So that's what they find. If you're staying for the conference, we are going to present a paper on this specific issue and basically just a much bigger sample, a similar kind of idea. I don't know why Africa's jumped behind the figure there. But it's you get about 85% of Africa represented in this sample, 157 cities, so quite a big sample. And what do we find? Well, for one, you can sort of split the sample between manufacturing and services. And you notice that there is a slightly positive coefficient to this regression line, right, between city size and this is sales per worker. So yes, you're getting a slight advantage, but it's very noisy. It's not a tight fit. So you might very well be in a big city over here, but look at your average productivity in that particular place. So we're seeing a lot of noise going on, and the same goes for services. Just sort of throw some more figures and things at you. Looking at different subsectors of manufacturing, what's interesting is you sort of find in manufacturing subsectors sort of smaller coefficients, whereas in services actually larger coefficients overall, so they tend to be statistically significant. So just again, a lot of variation by industry. And then look at the variation that you get at a country level, right? So South Africa, it is actually statistically significant where we are, but in many places, not really much of a relationship. Again, lots of technicalities in trying to model this all out, but I think the primary message is that when it comes to African cities, that there's a lot of noise going on, and I think that that's got to do with the quality of the governance and the quality of the infrastructure, that if you get some fundamentals right, there's no reason why your bigger cities shouldn't provide the benefits that they do, but in many cases that there aren't, right? And that's the sort of missed opportunity. That's the fundamental challenge, right? That if we get our cities working, urbanization can yield to benefits. But if we don't, then the relationship becomes watered down and can disappear altogether. So one of the sort of hot topics or provocations that out there is trying to make sense of Africa's urbanization. And one of the ideas that gets floated out is consumption city versus a production city. A production city, one where it's actually full of tradable goods and services, where firms can export, access market, be a part of global value chains, where a consumption city would be, well, you go to the city and you can buy a whole lot of stuff, but you actually don't have a whole lot of productive firms in it, right? You don't have the industrial base. This is quite interesting work. I think it's Remy Jedwab paper, and they try and sort of classify cities according to their industrial profile. And you can see that orange here is what they call a consumption city at a high, mid, and low level. So sort of the most extreme is red and the less extreme is yellow. And then on the flip side, a production city, sort of the low levels of production through to high levels of production from the light blue to the dark blue. So the blue is the sort of better color and the orange is the sort of worse color. How do they define productive versus consumptive? Well, manufacturing in terms of your industrial base, but also adding in tradable services. That would be sort of financial, what they call the FIRE sector. Financial services, insurance, business services, and real estate. So essentially a productive city would then have a higher share of those industrial activities within it. And you can sort of see the challenge from just looking at that color scheme, right? Is that many parts of, and many cities in Africa are showing that sort of orange and yellow color, meaning that a large share of the industry in those cities goes towards locally traded activities. So how can this happen? What sort of sustains it? Well, again, if you're a rich oil exporting nation and you develop your wealth through exporting oil, you can see that maybe you don't develop your industrial base and you do get some cities with a lot of wealth in them and you get a whole lot of services to service the elite. But actually beyond that, your industrial base is very, very weak. So there's sort of a linkage through to your pathway. Consumption cities being via natural resources, or linked to sort of premature deindustrialization, or a production city linked to manufacturing and tradable services. So I think this is sort of an open question as to Africa's cities, how firms become productive, and what really needs to take place to stop, help or hinder these dynamics. Great. So the last sort of 5 to 10 minutes, it's useful just to stand back and sort of ask some questions about what is interesting when it comes to thinking about cities and firms. What are some of the questions that hopefully some of you out there can start to answer with your master's or your PhD or beyond? I think the place to start is that we need better high-quality granular data. I think that's been a very big barrier to economists working on issues of economic geography. So if you're not aware, in the rest of the world, you've got thriving disciplines of urban economics and regional economics. You get people working on cities. It's massive conferences, lots of resources. It's popular. It's thriving. And yet when you come to Africa, you actually struggle to find people working on this issue of cities. And I think one of the things that is holds it back is that you need better data, okay? And so survey-based sources are obviously a place to start, but how do you push your survey down to the city level if it wasn't designed to do so in the first place? And I think in the South African context, I don't know how much of you kind of follow these things, but the last time Stats SA released economic information about local municipalities in South Africa was 2011, because they do a big survey called the Community Survey in 2016. They never released the labor market module. And the Census 2022, they've never released the labor market module. So a local municipality in South Africa is looking at 2011 for any information about its economy. And I think that's a real crisis. So the good news is that administrative sources are certainly viable and an opportunity and quite exciting. And you see over time a growing trend towards satellite imagery, for instance. A lot of great resources out there, global human settlements layer, for instance, but many other resources to analyze built environment data. It's exciting. And now also with firm and tax records. In South Africa, we've got the National Treasury Secure Data Facility, and UNU wider run their SA Tide program. And I've been involved with doing work to release data about firms and places based on that data source. So exciting opportunities there. So how do we improve the spatial resolution and data consistency across cities and countries? Thinking about how we define different boundaries for different cities. Interesting questions, but I think that's the place to start. I think the other obvious area is to be thinking more carefully about this urban premium in Africa, right? We think we need more empirical work to try and establish these different advantages, and more than that, to try and understand what different channels there are, right? Yes, you might see an advantage, but is it because of fundamentally access to knowledge-based institutions like universities? What role do they play? Is it about the high-skilled labor force, access to skilled workers? In fact, if you get skilled workers in your city, maybe that can really help you or not. So there's a big literature about how to do all of those things. I think these are all open questions in the African context, is what are the channels for that urban advantage? Is it just about better transport infrastructure, or is it more nuanced than that? I'm sure it's a range of all of those different things in reality. Okay. There's this big question about the consumption and the production city, right? Are African cities characterized as just these consumption hubs, right? And if so, how do we change that, right? How do we move away from a dominance of resource-driven urban economies towards better manufacturing hubs. A massive thing that I've said nothing about, which is probably a shame so far, is what to do about informality. Do the forces of agglomeration work in the same way for informal firms versus ones in the formal sector, or does it not matter? These are important research questions for us to engage with, right? What about knowledge spillovers between people and workers in different informal activities? And what are the barriers to formalization in many of our cities for firms? So again, our own context really matters, and I think we need a bigger agenda around informality, informal firms, and the way in which cities might help or hinder these advantages. I think the types of sectors is also really interesting, and we don't expect all sorts of firms to benefit in the same sorts of ways. Clearly, high-tech industries is big emphasis on accessing skilled labor in the workforce versus a manufacturing plant in clothing and textiles can have a different sort of agglomeration dynamic going on. And that can create opportunities for smaller specialized cities and certain activities versus the bigger cities diversifying. So again, a range of different questions in terms of different value chains, different sectors, and how this might play itself out. The dark side of agglomeration as well. What are the negative externalities? Which of them matters the most or the worst? Is it fundamentally about congestion, or is it about pollution, or which aspects are holding our firms back? How does it all fit together? Or is it about constraints to skills, for instance, or housing, or there are a range of these different factors, which are more important, which are less important? I think all clearly. What to do about segregation and spatial inequality in the midst of it, right? Great. And then last but not least, what about the quality of the governance itself? Different forms of land ownership. How do we innovate in that space? Does it all need to be formal title, or are there different approaches to doing that? I think these are open questions. What's the role for local cities and local governments? Is a local city just supposed to provide basic services, or should it be more proactive to try and entice big corporates and get these spillovers? Should it be investing in innovation precinct, etc., or should it give up? What's the role for local government and local industrial policy? Can it work? How does it work? SEZs. Okay, helpful or not helpful, and why? All of these are really interesting questions, and how to achieve mixed development. So I think hopefully I've given you a sort of overall flavor, and I hope that the big thing that you walk away from is to say, whatever you're doing in economics, actually there's a spatial reality to it, and to think more carefully about why and how that plays itself out, because there's always that angle of geography to it. So I hope that was helpful. Thanks very much. 1:15. Yeah.
Could you expand a bit? Does agglomeration logic apply to informal enterprises? Yeah. It seems to me they're much smaller is a starting point. And so possibly they apply more. If you're a small enterprise, you need the external environment more than a big self-contained company.
Yeah.
But if they're low productivity and there's not much technology and not much investment, then Andrew also showed that a lot of people work from home, at least in certain countries. We know that a lot of informal enterprises operate out of their houses. So maybe that's a constraint on their development. How do we unlock and enable these informal enterprises to grow in cities, I guess is the key question.
I agree. I think it is a key question, so I won't get trapped into giving an answer. But I also think in terms of different sectors, right? So you would think that the locally traded hairdresser has less scope versus thinking about other value chains and where they can fit in. Big retail in South Africa tends to dominate. How does it open the doors that informal firms can also benefit in the process? And then I think also in our own context, a big mystery or big sort of challenge is our level of informality is actually fairly low, right? So if our unemployment rates are so high, and we've got cities and people are in cities, what's stopping more informal firms from actually cropping up like they do in India and other parts where you see the informal economy play a bigger role to absorb surplus labor? And is it something to do with the way our cities are structured, the segregation that actually means that my middle class spend doesn't access the informal trader, whereas if I lived in a less segregated place, maybe my middle class spend could, and it would create more opportunities. So the way the built environment gets structured, I think, is very interesting questions around firms and informality. Great.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sitle Zulani from the University of Foreign. Mine is not a question, it's just a comment. Now, when you spoke about businesses that are allocated or firms that are located in the same area, with my experience data collection in the township, I found it more interesting that you see the businesses, they are closer to one another. So when you ask them about some of the questions around the competition, they will respond to say that the competition is not really a problem for them. It's good because it helps them to advance their businesses, and also that they build a relationship amongst themselves. So if we are going there to buy something and I don't have the item, I'm able to refer you to someone else. And also when it comes to the issue of buying the stock, when they get their stock, they'll tell you that no, even though we are located in the same area, so when it comes for us to get a stock, we are able to put money for transport together, and then we go and buy the stock together. So that means that we are also reducing the cost of transportation costs amongst ourselves. So I think that the same concept which applies to the formal businesses, it's also the same when it comes to the informal sector businesses. Thank you.
Definitely.